Good morning, class. Welcome. Today we're going to be covering a section of Chapter 2. It's the measurement and extent of poverty within the poverty chapter. So today what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to understand to calculate the official poverty line. We're going to describe some of the problems with that measurement. And then we're going to talk about the extent and some of the coinciding information regarding poverty. So our think, pair, share discussion questions for today. How's the poverty line calculated? How would you define the term food insecurity? Why do we have an official poverty line? What's the difference between systemic poverty and episodic poverty? What population, statistical group of people are more likely to live in poverty? So last week you learned what we mean when we say population in the social sciences or in science. We're talking about the characteristics of a statistical group. And then name a few myths about poverty. So the poverty line actually has a fairly simple calculation. It's your food cost times 3, and then that's the poverty line. So in the 1960s, this guy named Orshinki, he calculated that if you have a very minimal food budget and you're eating very simplistic, minimal, low-cost food, that if you take that cost and multiply it by 3, that's the level you would get for somebody who is in poverty or who's living in poverty. Now that was done in the 60s. It has not changed since then. So today we still use essentially that calculation. In other words, the average family in poverty spends or should spend approximately 1/3 of their income on housing, 1/3 of their income on necessities and bills, and 1/3 of their income on food. Clearly that has some issues, but that's approximately the best calculation we can do. So often we think about food insecurity as somebody who's going hungry, somebody who doesn't have enough money to be able to get enough calories. That's not necessarily the whole story. So food insecurity is reduced food intake, it's difficulty obtaining food, it's difficulty obtaining healthy food, and it's somebody who has to be preoccupied or have anxiety about obtaining food. In other words, you don't know if you're going to have enough money to have food for the entire week. You don't know where your next meal is coming from. You don't have access to things like grocery stores that have fruits and vegetables. In a lot of urban environments in the United States, we have what we call food deserts. And food deserts are essentially locations in the United States that people don't have access to food in general, healthy food, like actual groceries. So a lot of these places have solely access to fast food or convenience stores like gas station food. They don't have a real grocery store in walking distance, and in those areas, many people in rural and those less than urban areas or even urban areas don't have a means to getting to that grocery store. The level of food insecurity is actually fairly high, probably higher than you think. I have a chart here, but it's from 2012. It's a little bit of an old one, but it kind of gives us an idea. And so we have about, we're showing here from 0 to about 35 to 40% on this particular chart. So about 15%, almost 15% of all households have food insecurity as of 2012. When you look at the racial groups, it is Black non-Hispanic groups who have the highest rates of food insecurity at about 25%, it appears. Income to poverty ratio, so basically people with the highest level of income to poverty ratio, or people who are living at the lowest levels of income or the highest level of poverty have food insecurity. You could see that the numbers go up to 35-40% here. It is most commonly associated with principal cities, right? So we were talking about urban areas and food insecurity. And then we also see it more often, or most often, in the South. So how much does someone on minimum wage make, and how much does the average person in California in our income brackets essentially spend on food per week? So as of the time of this video, the minimum wage is approximately $12 an hour. So let's suppose that that person's working 40 hours a week. Now, do realize that the average person who has a minimum wage job does not have a full-time job, because most minimum wage jobs, Walmarts and fast food locations, they will never give their employees full-time positions. So we're supposing here this person probably has 2 jobs at minimum wage. That gives them about $1920 in before taxes. So in other words, they're making about $1,900 prior to their taxes taken out. The taxes can vary, but 1/3 of that would be approximately $640 prior to taxes taken out. So you can imagine that we could probably calculate that at around $550 for groceries for the month if you're using that entire 1/3 of your total expenses and income for the expense of groceries. So the federal poverty level is a little bit different than state levels, but the federal poverty level here, if we're looking at the 48 states, they calculate that for one person to be somebody who has an income of $1,316, and that's gross income, so before taxes. For a family of 4, that would be about $2,720 a month. So a little bit different in California, but that gives you a nice idea of the federal taxes. The federal income for poverty level. One of the reasons why they use the multiplier by 3 is that if you were to give a standard income ratio for the entire country, you're not taking into account the different cost of living from state to state, or from urban to suburban areas in the South versus on the East Coast or West Coast, or in the northern parts of the country. So you can imagine that the amount of money that you make, the cost of groceries, and the cost of your housing are going to vary widely from state to state. So if you look at, for example, if we were to compare California to Nebraska, somebody who lives in Nebraska is going to have a much lower cost of food monthly than somebody who lives in California. The same also goes for if you have one person in your household versus, say, 2 working adults and 4 children, so 6 people in your household. So traditionally, I left this in here because traditionally, if we were in the classroom setting, I have students take a moment to look at the census. You can look at the census.gov, like the quick facts. You can look this up yourself. It's really easy, actually, to access census quick facts, and they're easy to read. But that will give you California geography charts, unemployment, racial categories, that kind of thing. And so I would have students do things like pick a city, and you would research your average rent, car insurance, car prices, fuel prices, food, gas, electric, that kind of stuff, and then see how much a couple on minimum wage make and compare that to how much you would really need to earn to be comfortable in that situation. Now, we know recently, after the pandemic or after the initial phases of the pandemic, food and the cost of a lot of goods has increased dramatically. With the increase in cost of food, which they've calculated currently at about somewhere between 7 and 9% increase in food, that pushes a lot more people into poverty and means that a lot more people in California, in the United States, can be labeled as food insecure. So why do we have the poverty line? Well, it serves two primary reasons. This allows us to establish eligibility for individual people and for families, so that we can offer aid at an appropriate level across the United States. And it's also so that the federal government can gauge the number of Americans who are struggling financially. That's why we know and we keep track of not just the increases of costs and food and supplies and housing and that kind of thing, the cost of or the price of income that people are making, right? The amount of income people are making. And it allows the federal government to kind of keep a running census on where people are and where they stand. Now, I posted here this chart for you, and this chart shows the highest food insecure states in the United States and the lowest food insecure states in the United States. So you could see here in the moderate orange color, we've got most of the West Coast. So California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, New Mexico, those types of areas, right? So they have a fairly high, moderate level of food insecure people. Our highest states are Texas. It's the South, essentially, right? So we have areas in the South that have the highest levels of food insecurity. If you were to look at states that are what we call right-to-work states or non-union states, these coincide dramatically. So we have the highest levels of poverty in right-to-work non-union states and some of the lowest levels of food insecurity and poverty in states that have higher unionization participation, because that increases the income for everybody, not just people who are in the unions themselves. It increases the average wage, and more people are closer to a living wage. So let's look at this from a theoretical perspective. So we're going to look at it from the functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interaction perspective. So from a functionalist perspective, economic stratification, meaning that people are poor, middle class or middle income, wealthy or very rich. So people are separated among economic lines, and we have a class system, is interpreted differently based on the theoretical perspective that you're looking at. So from a functionalist perspective, stratification in society, class stratification especially, is necessary so that we can induce within people the desire to work harder. It is going to allow for, in society, people with higher intelligence or special intelligence, a greater knowledge base, a greater skill set, to enter into the most prestigious and important occupations. And so from a functionalist perspective, stratification along class lines is both inevitable and necessary. What that means is that from this functionalist perspective, those who are the most intelligent, capable, skilled, and hardworking are going to get the highest paid jobs. Those people are going to become, president, doctors, lawyers, that type of thing. And those people with the lowest skills, lowest intelligence, and lowest capability or lowest work ethic will go into the lowest paid jobs. So we would talk about things like fast food or janitorial work or that type of thing. From a conflict perspective, stratification is not a necessity and not even inevitable. It is the result of a lack of opportunity or a lack of access to resources. So those who have the most access to resources, those who are born into privilege to begin with, are going to move into jobs that are higher paying, and they're going to have, again, they're going to be at the top of the ladder. And those who are poor or people of color or women are going to have less access to resources, less access to the economy, and are going to stay within the lower economic strata. From a symbolic interaction perspective, remember this is the micro level theory, whereas functionalist and conflict theories are macro level, so they look at society wide. Symbolic interaction theory says that it's about an individual interaction, right? So stratification both affects and creates our cultural norms. So it's going to affect our lifestyles, our beliefs, our daily interaction with other individuals, and even your perception of yourself. So you can think about it this way. You are going to treat somebody in the lower socioeconomic status position in a very different way than you would treat somebody in a higher socioeconomic status position. And the same goes in reverse. If you are living in poverty, if you are living in a houseless position, you're going to be treated very differently than if you are wealthy, you live in a very prestigious neighborhood, you're dressed in very expensive clothing, that type of thing. So what's the difference between systemic and episodic poverty? So when people think about poverty, they often just kind of lump everything together. But social scientists and people who are studying social problems see that there's two very different perspectives on poverty, and they have different latent and obvious consequences. So somebody who lives in systemic poverty, this is a poverty that's linked to the structure of the system. So the social structures within society, it's built into our institutions. These individuals, these groups of people are in long-term generational or intergenerational persistent poverty. You know, they're born into it, they live through it through their whole lives. Everybody they know is living in poverty, and their children and their children's children will also live in poverty and or financial instability. So this with low wage stagnation, or people who are economically and socially excluded from the access to resources from various institutions like higher education, the healthcare system, even the food network. We were just talking about, places that are what we call food deserts. So there's a fairly large population in the United States who lack access to grocery stores, right? So that's systemic poverty. Episodic poverty is slightly different. So defined by the census, right? So the Census Bureau, it's if somebody individually or a family is living in poverty or is financially unstable for a smaller time period. So you are poor for a couple months. It can happen once, twice, 5 times to you or your family within your lifetime, but you move in and out of that. So that's episodic poverty. We have a theorist who essentially said, Weber, essentially says that essentially coins this term that says people have different life chances, right? So this is a social theory that says that the opportunities each individual has to either improve their quality of life or that inhibits their quality of life um, creates a situation where different groups of people have different life chances, or another way of saying it, have different access to the economy, to resources to get a job, like to access to education, access to skilled apprenticeship, those types of things. This describes for us how likely it is that an individual's life will turn out in a particular way. So we can identify by a person's life chances how likely they are to have a higher socioeconomic status or a lower socioeconomic status. So a child living in poverty has more difficulty excelling in the education system, developing skills, developing cognitive abilities. Poor people in general experience more health issues over their lifetimes, more mental health issues over their lifetime, significantly more problems within the family, and more crime within their communities. And a news report that came out in 2011 talked about a survey regarding kids going hungry in school. And it found that in public schools, the survey was of over 600 public schools, that a significant number of K through 8th grade students were going to school extremely hungry. Many of them had not eaten since the day before at lunchtime, and that it was a serious enough problem that students were not able to focus in school, they were not able to learn, and that teachers, while being paid probably the lowest in these particular schools, were covering the cost and buying food for their students so that their students can focus on academia. So we know, based on Maslow's hierarchy, that if somebody doesn't have a place to live, if they're hungry, they can't focus on those higher cognitive issues in society. So you're not going to be interested in politics. You're not going to be interested in learning. All of your energy and all of your thought must go to where your next meal is going to come from, if you can make rent, if you're going to have a roof over your head, if you're in a situation where you are food insecure or financially insecure. So these teachers were actually buying food for their students. Now, from 2000 and I believe in 2018 or 2019, the first year of the Trump administration, there was a policy that was set, a law that was enacted into policy in several of these states that made it illegal for these teachers to buy food for these students. So why do we use this official poverty line, and why has it not changed since 1963? So we know that this system of calculating the official poverty line is out of date. I mean, clearly it's approximately 60 years old. We know expenses have increased. We know expenses occupy a greater percentage of a family's budget compared to the 1960s. And we even know that the cost of housing has increased dramatically, and it takes up a lot more than a third of a family's budget. However, we have not found another way to calculate the poverty line that works as good as this. So it still is in use today, and it still seems to be the best method for calculating the poverty line despite its problems. So oftentimes when we hear about the poverty line, we hear about who it is that is living in poverty and why they live in poverty. So let's talk a little bit about who lives in poverty, who are food stamp recipients, and some of the myths and misconceptions about those people. So most people who live in poverty today are children. Most of the people who benefit from food stamps are, again, children. And the next slide we'll talk about different racial categories and men and women, that type of thing. Some of the myths and misconceptions regarding poverty and who lives in poverty. If we just leave things alone, companies will lift up the poor, right? So we are a capitalist economy. We are in our norms and our values and our culture. We truly believe in capitalism. And we believe as a nation, our values are that capitalism somehow will effectively solve the problems, including things like poverty. So if we just don't do anything, if left to their own devices, organizations and companies will be able to lift people up out of poverty. That people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. In other words, if they just worked harder, if they just put in more effort, if they just learned skills, they would be able to lift themselves up out of poverty. What we do know is most people who are food insecure, who go hungry, and who live in poverty are children. So most of us, when we start to think about that, realize that we shouldn't be asking children themselves to develop skills and get a job so that they could have food on a regular basis. Also, this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is an interesting misnomer because it's technically impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And that was kind of the crux of the saying to begin with. And somehow it's shifted and it's kind of flipped in its meaning today. The American dream is gained by merit. So this is very much the functionalist perspective that if you are poor, if you are hungry, it's because you lack merit, you lack, it's your fault, right? It's the individual's fault. They should work harder. They should, develop skills or get an education or do a better job. That people aren't really poor, that they're just bad at managing their money properly. So when we know that the cost of housing today is approximately 70 to 90% of the lowest wage income, and that groceries or food at a very minimal basis is at least 30% of the average minimum wage income, and that the cost of bills and necessities for life is about 50%, you start to realize that it's not necessarily a money management issue. That people who are poor are just lazy and don't want to work. So people who are working minimum wage jobs often have 2 to 3 jobs. They often are working more than 10 hours a day. And it doesn't seem to be that it is because of a lack of willingness to work. Additionally, those at the highest levels of the economy, those who are the wealthiest, don't work for a living. Their money earns them money. People are addicted to alcohol and drugs, and people who live on benefits have an easy life. So, recently, in the last decade or so, there were 7 different states that were decided to do drug testing for welfare recipients. They spent millions of dollars doing this, and they found almost nobody who tested positive for drugs. So what they basically realized was they were wasting money on drug tests, and the people who were receiving benefits were not testing positive. And so we can kind of gather from that they're not necessarily on drugs. So one of the things that people talk about too is that the economy, that the nation, because of our overall budget, we can't afford food stamps for people, that we're subsidizing people, that we're essentially a welfare state, and going along with these myths or misnomers that those people don't deserve it, they're just on drugs, and that, it's not the responsibility of taxpayers to pay for those people who are not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, again, let's talk about who is receiving SNAP benefits or food stamp benefits. Approximately half of everybody who receives benefits is a child, so they're under the age of 18. Almost 10% of those people are elderly, so people tend to be most food insecure when they're very young or they're very old. And then the other portion is disabled households, so people with severe physical disabilities. If you think about your own taxes, if you, for example, make about $50,000 a year, approximately $36 of your taxes that you pay is going to go towards food stamps yearly. About $6 goes to other safety net programs. About $870 goes to food subsidies. About $1,600 goes to offset corporate loopholes, and about $1,200 goes to offset losses for corporate tax havens overseas. So it costs us approximately $4,000 a year for an average worker who makes about $50,000 a year to subsidize corporations, and it costs us about $45 a year to subsidize children, the elderly, and the disabled to eat. What that means essentially is that we have a very strong, healthy corporate welfare system, and we have a fairly weak and minimal welfare system for those who are at the most risk of starvation. Another argument that people will often make is that it's always people of color who are on the system, who are taking benefits, who are lazy and who don't want to work. So when we actually study the statistics, we find that it's about 42% of poor people would consider themselves white, non-Latino. Almost 30%, 28.7% are Latino, 23% are Black, and about 3.7% are Asian. This is as of 2017. So if you look at just participating in SNAP or food stamps benefits, it's about 9 million families that label themselves as white who are participating in those benefits or receiving those benefits. It's about 5.9 million who are African American. Throughout the country, about 2.4 million who are Hispanic, and then about almost 3 million who define themselves as multiracial. If you were to listen to the media, you would tend to believe it's mostly Blacks and Hispanics. So how are we kind of misinformed in this way? So I found a chart that describes benefits in a different way. So they're looking at proportionality instead of actual numbers. So the one I was just showing you, you can see clearly, let's go back for, no, it won't let me. You could see clearly that the majority of people in the United States who are poor, the majority of people in general in the United States consider themselves to be white, and the second highest population is black. But if you look at the proportions, so instead of the actual numbers, then you can flip those statistics, and I could essentially lie to you with these statistics if you don't understand what you're looking at, or if you don't understand statistics in general. So it's about 70% of our entire population that's white. So even though the majority of people receiving food benefits and welfare benefits are white, the proportion of those people compared to the total population is smaller. Here we're showing it's about 8.6%. Whereas if you look at the native black population, it's about 27% of the population who is black from their total in the United States who's receiving benefits. So if I didn't know what I was looking at and I didn't know the numbers, in my mind here, I would see that it's mostly black and native Hispanics who are receiving benefits, when that's not the case. Even if it was, you know, keep in mind that it's children, right? So 45% of those people are children. So whether they're black, Hispanic, white, Asian, it's mostly children who are gaining from food stamps or SNAP benefits. We have known for a really long time that there's been a feminization of poverty. In other words, women are more likely to live in poverty when they're young. They're more likely in adulthood to experience poverty, at least episodic poverty. And then in old age, women are more likely to experience poverty and food insecurity. Women live longer than men. Women make less than men. Women are in much more precarious financial situations when divorced. They often end up with the children. So what we found is that about 16% or 25 million women and girls live in poverty in the United States. Compare that to about 21 million boys and men who live in poverty in the United States. So women are more likely to both experience systemic poverty over their lifetime and episodic poverty. And they're also more likely to experience poverty with their children in tow. It's almost 40%, 37% of all children who live in poverty in any given year. And the poverty rate for children in the United States is the highest of all wealthy democratic societies in the world. So we have the highest levels of poverty, or have the highest levels of children experiencing poverty of any wealthy nation in the world. Okay, so here is your writing workshop. How's the poverty line calculated? What are some of the ways that people are food insecure? Why do we have an official poverty line? What's the difference between systemic and episodic poverty? What are the populations of people that are more likely to live in poverty or experience it? And then name a few myths. Have a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture.